to film Clint Eastwood's performance in an interview on The Uncensored Truth. With the crowd anticipated nothing less than Madison Steele yet. Another A-lister, just another controversy. The fact that swift and well-known, Madison is a young woman dismantling conservative symbols was going to make the biggest mistake of her work. She was certain she had him in the bag, prepared for a simple moment of virality. But what? What transpired afterwards became legendary. Overnight, just as Clint Eastwood always does, he didn't argue, he didn't flinch. Instead, he converted the full interview into the most unexpected lesson about faith, conviction, and why genuine strength never falls out of style. It was a night like any other on The Unfiltered Truth with Madison Steele. The audience muttered in anticipation, their faces illuminated by the glimmer of studio lights. The camera saltered their angles. The sleek polished floor reflecting the immaculate set. The show had developed a reputation as one of the most watched liberal talk programs in the country. A space where reactionary figures walked in, with their heads held high, and often left, picking up the pieces of their reputations. And tonight, Madison Steele had her largest guest ever. Madison Steele, young blonde razor. She had spent the last 5 years perfecting her brand of aggressive gotcha style journalism. She was aggressive, ripping through visitors like a knife into heated butter. Her smile as deadly as her perfectly choreographed questions. Some dubbed her a rising star, others a pompous opportunist who lives for viral takedowns. Either way, her audience liked her. She wasn't simply here to interview Clint Eastwood. She was here to make a moment. A 94-year-old conservative legend sat across from her. It was too excellent to pass up. He was the perfect target, Hollywood royalty, an icon of old-school masculinity. A man who had talked frankly about values Madison believed were obsolete. She had taken down senators, CEOs, and controversial figures before. But this one was going to be historic as the show intro blared through the speakers. The energy in the studio shifted. The crowd was ready. The social media team stood by, prepped to clip and submit the segment. The second it got him. This wasn't just an interview. That was an occasion. And then Clint Eastwood walked in. He moved gently, but with undeniable presence. He didn't need theatrics. He didn't need an entrance. The weight of who he was did all the talking. But as he sank himself into the chair, across from Madison, anything else caught her sight. Around his neck, dangling just beneath the collar of his shirt, was a tiny silver cross. Madison blinked, her head already functioning. Yep, this was gonna be easier than she anticipated. The cameras panned wide, framing the two figures seated across from each other. Madison Steele, with her flawless makeup and steely blue eyes, leaned forward, lightly expressing the same confidence that had made her famous. Clint Eastwood, comfortable yet inscrutable, rested his hands on his lap, his posture effortless, but commanding. The contrast was almost poetic. A young media powerhouse at the peak of her influence, and a legend whose very name carried weight outside the industry. And for Madison, this was just another match to win. The audience was primed, waiting, anticipating the moment she'd start peeling him separate brick by brick. She had studied his prior interviews, saw his old film, understood exactly what buttons to push. The producers had preloaded clips of questionable statements he'd made over the years, ready to roll at the proper moment. But before they even got there, Madison's gaze moved back to that cross necklace, tiny, worn, unassuming. Her lips moved into a smirk. Oh, this was a gift. Religion wasn't a topic Hollywood loved to touch anymore. Especially not the kind Clint symbolized, traditional, conservative, a remnant of a time the industry had attempted to move past. Madison already saw that the headline, Clint Eastwood out of touch with current America, Hollywood legend, clings to antiquated beliefs and gets called out on live TV. She didn't even need to plot this angle. It had written itself. Still, Clint gave nothing away. He sat there, the lights shining down, but he remained unshaken, unbothered, as if he had already seen this all before. Since, of course, he had glared down. Director studio executives complete generations of critics who thought they could write him off. He had outlasted them all, and now at 94, he was set to square off with Madison Steele, not as an opponent, but as an observer. She thought she was leading the allegation. She didn't realize Clint Eastwood had already won. The air in the studio was thick with expectation. The audience had settled into that pleasant spot between curiosity and fun, waiting for the moment Madison Steele would strike. They have seen this play out before. Her guest would relax, be caught in their rhythm of speech, and just when they least thought it, she'd land the first blow, and right on cue Madison leaned in, her distinctive smile tugging at the corners of her lips. She always knew when to push, when to act. Amused, when to act. Worried. It was a Formula One she had honed over the years. She gestured casually toward Clint's chest where the little silver crucifix necklace rested just behind his collar. Clint, I have to ask, what's with the cross? Didn't peg you for the jewelry kind. The audience chuckled light, scattered laughs. Some thought it was an innocent jest, just pleasant banter. Others, they noticed it. The arrangement, the shift in tone that implied Madison wasn't just asking. She was probing a test, a challenge. Clint didn't react, nor in the way she wanted him to. He didn't shift uncomfortably, didn't furrow his brow, or with a defiant grin. Instead, he sat there entirely at peace, letting the words float in the air, unclaimed and insignificant. Then, he did something that thrown her off just a little. He smiled, not a forced, immediate, trained smile, not a nervous or uneasy one. No, it was something different. Totally. It was the kind of smile a man offers when he's heard this all before the crowd. Wasn't sure what to think of it. The chuckles fizzled out. A few individuals, moving in their seats. They had observed guests blunder on this program. But Clint Eastwood wasn't fumbling. He was just observing. Madison caught the hesitation in the air, the energy that wasn't quite going her way. She needed to push further, so she did. Madison tilted her head, pretending to comprehend his reaction. Or rather, his lack of response. Come on, Clint, she said, her voice taking on that honeyed, disdainful tone she reserved for guests she was about to destroy. You've built an entire career playing the tough guy, the cowboy, the non-nonsense enforcer, the man who doesn't take directions from anyone. She let the words sink, letting them paint him into a corner, and then, with perfect timing, she delivered the punchline. And yet here you are, sporting a cross. Like some choir boy laughed louder this time. Some people in the audience clapped. That was what she wanted. That reaction, that moment. She saw the glimmer of movement from the producers at the back of the studio, the signal that they had just clipped the soundbite, that it was already being polished for social media. A sly smirk grew across her lips. She pressed further. Come on, Clint. Isn't this a little obsolete, a little, what's the word? Out of to touch. More laughs. She could already imagine the headlines. Hollywood legend trapped in time warp. Clint Eastwood clings to old-school religion in a changing world. Her eyes shined as she inspected his face, waiting for him to break, to fumble for an answer, to give her the reaction she sought. But Clint Eastwood didn't fumble. He didn't even blink. He only lifted his eyes slowly, methodically, and in that moment, the air moved. The laughter died down, but not because the joke was over. It was, since everyone in the room instantly realized the joke was never on him. It focused on her. The room hushed. The air that had been humming with laughter just seconds ago now felt heavy, motionless, like the moment before a storm sweeps in. Clint Eastwood sat there quiet, undisturbed, his expression unreadable. He didn't fidget, didn't peek toward the cameras, didn't react the way guests were supposed to on the unadulterated truth. He just let the silence breathe, and then in that distinctive growly voice, the kind it carried decades of weight with Berelia. Few phrases he spoke. You assume it's hilarious his words weren't loud. They weren't sharp, but they cut through the room like a knife anyhow. Madison Steele chuckled, but it was different now. Forced doubtful, the confidence in her posture failed for just a short second, barely visible unless you were paying attentiveness. Clint was paying attention. No, I simply... Well, it's a bit surprising, that's all she said. Still trying to keep control. Her tone was lighter, now backpedaling. I mean, faith isn't exactly Hollywood's favorite subject these days. She smiled again. Yet this time, it didn't land the way it typically did, because Clint Eastwood wasn't playing the game. His gaze focused upon hers, steady, unreadable. He wasn't on the defense. He wasn't even bothered. And then, finally, he gave her the answer she wasn't expecting. That's why I don't care what Hollywood thinks. The words landed like a hammer. No explanation, no justification, just a fact. The audience shifted. Some of them had been waiting, causing him to stumble, to scramble for footing. But instead, he had just placed himself like a stone wall. Madison opened her mouth, but for the first time in a long time, she didn't sure what to say. Because Clint Eastwood hadn't just answered her. He had ended the chat. The studio was so quiet now that you could hear the faint buzz of thecums rolling. The shift had happened. The same shift that always happened when Clint Eastwood decided to take hold of the moment. Slowly, carefully, Clint lifted the little silver crucifix necklace between his fingers, holding it up just enough for the camera to catch the way the light flashed against its surface. His thumb brushed across the faded margins, a motion so simple, so absent of theatrics, that it somehow made the moment even heavier. And then he spoke. This was my father's. No build-up. No grand show. Only the truth. He wore it every day of his life when he passed. I kept it. The crowd wasn't chuckling anymore. They were listening. Madison's face had softened just slightly. Not enough to display weakness, yet enough to show that this wasn't the answer she expected. Clint didn't glance at her while he spoke, didn't try to convince anyone in the room of anything. Not because I thought it looked good. Not because it's a trend. He hesitated, still turning the cross over in his fingers. But because it recalls me of who I am there. It was the transformation in the room, the shift in the energy, the shift in the entire discourse. The people in the audience who had laughed at the joke just minutes ago were now leaning forward, their amusement gone. Because what Clint had just stated wasn't merely about him, it was about them. Then came the final line, the one that pierced straight through the program, across the entire point of this interview. Some people wear jewelry to show off. He gazed up, this time meeting eyes with Madison Steele. Some wear it because it signifies anything. Stillness. Madison sat there, looking unsure what to say. The crowd, they had already decided who had won this moment. Because once again Clint Eastwood had spoken and the world was listening. The laughter was gone, not faded, not quieted, gone in its place. A heavy, uneasy quiet loomed over the studio like a thick fog. The very audience that had been so eager to laugh, together with Madison Steele only minutes ago, now shuffled uneasily in their seats. Some exchanged glances, others stared straight ahead, uncertain whether they were still intended to be entertained or if anything real was happening. And at the core of it all, Clint Eastwood, calm, still, unshaken across from him. Madison Steele was trying not to squirm. She had been here before. Interviews that go to uncomfortable occasions where a guest pushed back. But yet this was different, because Clint wasn't pushing back. He was just sat there, letting the weight of his words settle like stones on the studio floor. She forced a laugh, a touch too brilliant to rehearse, the kind of chuckle that stated, I still retain control over this moment. I wasn't attempting to berate Clint, she said, tilting her head slightly. The warmth in her tone now laced with something else, defensiveness. I just think it's an interesting choice for someone like you. She gestured vaguely toward the cross as if trying to turn the moment back into something light, something fun. But Clint wasn't playing. His reply came, without hesitation, firm and confident. You wouldn't have mocked it if it was any other sign. The audience mumbled some, nodded some, whispered. Because they knew he was right. And Madison knew it too. She just couldn't admit it. Madison Steele was good at what she did. One of the finest. She has spent years refining her skills, understanding exactly how to navigate challenging occasions, how to reinterpret a chat when it wasn't going her perspective. And right now, she needed to redefine. Thus, she leaned back ever so slightly in her chair, changing her posture, softening her expression, make it look like she was simply having a friendly conversation. Glance, I respect faith, I do. She said, her voice quieter now, nearly diplomatic. I just think we've moved past requiring things like that. A modest nod, a slight shrug, as if she was only making a decent perspective. The crowd watched, the crew waited, and Clint didn't flinch, didn't blink, didn't lean forward, didn't do anything but maintain his ground as he'd been doing for about a century. Then he talked slow, measured, certain, moved past. Requiring faith, he let the words linger, his gaze never leaving hers, and then the question that hit like a bullet. Tell me something, darling, what do you believe in? The crowd leaned in and, for the first time all night, Madison Steele stumbled. It was subtle, a flicker of hesitation, a fraction of a second, because she didn't have the perfectly polished response ready to go. The cameras caught it. The audience felt it. And Clint Eastwood, he saw it. And then the knockout phrase, because if you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything. The stillness following that was different, not tense, not weird, just end. The moment that had started as a joke was now engraved into history, because Madison Steele had walked into this interview thinking she was the one set up the trap. And Clint Eastwood, he had barely closed it. It happened swiftly, faster than anyone imagined before the interview had even concluded, before Madison Steele had an opportunity to issue some well-crafted damage control statement, before the network even had time to choice how to spin it. The internet had already said the clip went viral. Not merely trending, not just garnering attention, it was everywhere. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. Within minutes, the sound clip of Clint's dying remarks, "If you don't stand for something, you'll fall for anything," was being replayed, clipped, and examined by millions, trending hashtags. Clint, schools, Madison, faith matters, reverence the cross, and their actions, they flooded in like a flood. She felt she was going to humiliate Clint. He ended her whole argument. Hollywood mocks faith till a legend reminds them why it still matters. Notice how she had nothing to say after that. Madison attempted to twist it, but Clint wasn't playing her game. Here is why old school values still matter. People like Eastwood don't need to prove anything. Their wisdom speaks for itself. Madison's regular backing, ERS Theonies, who lived for her viral takedowns, weren't laughing this time. Some defended her urgently, trying to shift the narrative. He was condescending, had dismissed her opinions. She was just asking questions. Clint Eastwood is out of touch with modern principles. But it wasn't staying, because the event was too real, too unspin, too powerful. The media scrambled. Some outlets sought to diminish it, calling it a vigorous argument or a generational misunderstanding. Others leaned into it, admitting that Madison Steele had lost control of the interview. And then, the biggest clue, that Clint had won. The network removed the interview from their homepage. They didn't want a platform. The very time that had established Clint Eastwood as a great all over again. The dust hadn't even settled. When the reporters came hunting for him, they wanted a declaration, a response, a victory lap. But Clint, he didn't do. Victory laps a week after the interview. A journalist caught up with him outdoors. Café in Carmel, California, his peaceful tinny town by the sea. The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone street. As Clint adjusted his jacket, the similar faded silver cross sitting beneath his collar, a reporter mic in hand raced forward him. Mr. Eastwood, do you have any comment to the viral interview? Clint paused, took a leisurely sip of his coffee, and finally smirked a sneer that stated all. Then, in that characteristic growly tone, he supplied the only reaction he ever needed. Nope. And just like that, he walked away. No explanations, no justifications, no arguing with individuals who already lost. Since true legends don't explain themselves, they don't fight for approval, they don't try to win internet arguments, they just stand for what they believe in. And that's why Clint Eastwood, having already won, wished to hear more of this. Then click on the video on the right-hand side, which is even more insane.